Orchestrated fresh Canadian Western narrative with new characters and plot variations. Orchestrated fresh Canadian Western narrative with new characters and plot variations. The valley belonged to Ezra Marlowe, down to the last blade of frostbitten grass, and standing at his window that gray October morning, he felt none of it. Cattle moved like slow brown stones across the foothills below, hundreds of them, his by brand and by law. Beyond defense lines, the land climbed toward the Rockies, the peaks already white, and somewhere out there a Chinook arch was building along the horizon. That long band of warm cloud the old hands swore could melt a foot of snow in an afternoon. He owned the deeded sections and grazed twice as many under lease from the territories. Men in Calgary tipped their hats to him, and he stood with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, and could not have said, if you'd asked him, why he bothered to keep drawing breath. He was 44 years old. 15 winters he had run this place out of nothing but stubbornness and luck. 11 of those winters had passed since Cora died, and the child with her, a son who never once took air into his lungs. 11 years of a quiet so total it had stopped being absence and become a sound, a low ringing he heard in the moments before sleep and the moments after waking. He poured the coffee into the wash basin and watched it swirl down gray, and that was when Angus knocked. Angus McRae had foremanned the Marlowe outfit for 9 years and had never once knocked on the kitchen door before sunup. Ezra knew it was him by the particular weight of the boots. "There's a woman at the gate," Angus said through the wood. "Walked in. No horse, no wagon. Says she's after work. We're not hiring." Told her that. Then she'll have got the message. A pause. Ezra could picture his foreman turning his hat in his hands, choosing. "She's not leaving, Ezra. Been standing at that gate since before the light. Came up the coulee on foot. From the rail stop, most like. And that's a long, cold walk for a body with nothing but a bag to carry." Another pause. "I'd not send a dog back out that road this morning. Thought you should see her before I did." In 9 years, Angus had never argued an order. Not once. Ezra set down the basin. "5 minutes," he said, and went out into the cold. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 26, standing very straight by the gatepost with a canvas satchel held against her stomach in both arms, the way a person holds the only thing they own. Her coat was thin for the weather, and her boots were cracked across the toe. Frost had silvered the loose hair at her temples. But it was her face that stopped him in the yard. Not because she was handsome, though she might have been once, in some other life with more food in it and less weather. What stopped him was how still her eyes were. Not frightened. Emptied. He knew that stillness. He shaved in front of it every morning. "I'm Marlowe," he said. "This is my land. Adelaide Renner." Her voice was low and even, the cold in it, but no shaking. She did not put out her hand. "My man says you want work." "I do." "Doing what?" "Whatever wants doing. I can cook, I can keep a house, I can mend, I can put in a garden and make it grow. I'm stronger than I look, and I don't quit a thing half done." She said it plainly, like she was reading a feed bill. "Where have you come from?" The smallest hitch before she answered. "From the east." "That's a country, not a place." "It's the answer I've got." He let the silence stretch. She let it stretch right back, and never dropped her eyes once, which most folk did. "You running from something, Miss Renner?" "Everyone out here is running from something, Mr. Marlowe. You'd know that better than I would." It landed clean, the truth of it, and something in him that had been asleep a long while shifted just slightly. "That's a lot to ask," he said. "Take a stranger on, no people, no character to vouch you, nothing but your own word." "It is." For the first time something crossed her face, not quite a smile. "But you're the one with thousands of acres to lose. I've got this bag and these boots. Seems to me the larger risk is yours, and you're the one standing here deciding to take it." He near about laughed. He could not remember the last time the impulse had visited him. "Room and board," he heard himself say. "No wage the first month. After that we'll talk. There's a cabin behind the house. Used to be the cook's before he went to town. Bed and a stove and not much else. You'll feed me and whatever hands are near enough to come in. You'll keep the big house. If you steal from me, I'll have the mounted police on you by dark. If you can't do the work, you're gone. We clear." "We're clear." "When can you start?" "Now," she said, "if you'll have me." He nodded at Angus and turned for the house without waiting to watch her go in. Inside, where the thick stone walls held off the worst of the wind, he stood a long moment in the cold hall and asked himself what in God's name he was doing. Angus had been right about the law of the thing. She could be running from anything, a debt, a crime, a husband. The wise course was a tin of water and good luck on the road. But when she'd looked at him with those scoured-out eyes, he had seen the only thing left in himself, and some ruined corner of him had recognized a fellow survivor and refused to send her off to die in a coulee. The cabin was exactly what he'd promised. One room, a narrow rope bed, a tin stove, a window facing the big house across the yard. Adelaide set her satchel on the table and sat down on the bed, and for the first time in 9 days let herself stop moving. Inside her boots, her feet were raw and weeping where the blisters had burst 2 days back on the gravel grade beside the railway. She'd wrapped them with strips off her spare shift. Tomorrow she'd have to tend them properly or risk the rot. Tomorrow. The word felt like something borrowed. It implied she would still be here. She unpacked, which took no time at all, 2 worn dresses, a comb with broken teeth, a little tin of needles and thread, and wrapped in flannel at the very bottom. A thing she did not take out, only touched once through the cloth to be sure of it, and then pushed deep beneath the straw of the mattress where no hand but hers would think to go. By noon she had crossed the yard, found the big house unlocked, and walked into 11 years of neglect. It was not filth. Ezra Marlowe was not a man who tolerated filth. It was absence, the dust of a place where nobody had cared whether a thing was clean or fallen apart. She found an apron on a hook, tied it on, and got to work. He came in at 6 and stopped in the doorway. The long table was set, plain but proper, and a pot of stew steamed at its center with biscuits beside it. "You cooked," he said, like the word was foreign. "That's what you hired." He ate like a man who'd forgotten he was hungry, then realized he had been hungry for months. When she rose to clear, he stood and took up a towel without being asked, and they washed and dried in the small kitchen, circling each other in the narrow space. "Breakfast at first light," he said at the door. "Don't wait supper past dark for me. Some nights I'm out with the herd." He paused. "The cabin warm enough?" "More than enough." "Good night, Miss Renner." The first week ran out, like water finding its level. She rose before the light and had coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe by the time he appeared, always wearing the same expression of a man watching his own life from a distance. While he was out chasing strays or arguing fence with Angus, she cleaned the house room by grimy room, turned out curtains thick as felt, scoured floors no broom had touched in years. In the brief gentleness of midday she went at the patch of ground behind the cabin where some former cook had once kept a garden gone to thistle and seed. It was far too late in the season for it, and the frost would take whatever rose. She turned the cold soil anyway and pressed in the few seeds she found in a kitchen jar because that was what a person did. You planted and you waited, and sometimes against all sense a thing grew. The hands kept their distance. They'd touch their hats when she passed and never come close, and she was grateful for it. Then, on the Tuesday of the second week, a boy of 19 named Davy Pruitt turned up at the kitchen door, hat in both hands, his left arm held stiff against his side. "Drawn off a green colt," he allowed, "shoulder gone wrong, and a shirt with the buttons torn clean off in the dirt. Would she, if it weren't too much trouble?" She took the shirt. "I'll do it this once, on account of the arm," she told him. "But I'm not a tailor and this isn't a service. You've needles in the bunkhouse, and God gave you 10 fingers. Next time you mend it your own self." He went away red and grateful, and word traveled the way it always does in close quarters, and by Thursday 3 more shirts had appeared on her cabin step, left by men too shy to ask. She mended them all, because what else did she have to do with an evening? But she sent it through Angus, plain, that she was no man's mother, and the laundry of grown cowboys was their own affair. The shirt stopped coming. On the Friday Ezra came in early and went straight to the kitchen instead of to wash, and his forearm was wrapped in a kerchief doing a poor job of holding the blood. A door on the brand iron crib had caught him, he said. It was nothing. "Sit down, Mr. Marlowe," she said. "Before you bleed on a floor I've only just got clean," and something flickered in his eyes and he sat. The cut was deep but tidy, near 4 inches. She washed it and her hands were quick and gentle, and he watched her face while she worked, the small white scars and old burns on her fingers that spoke of a lifetime of hard kitchens. This wants stitching, she said. It'll knit. They'll knit better closed. I can do it if you'll let me. You sew wounds. I sew cloth. I've done worse than this on a kicked horse and a careless man or two. She held the needle in the lamp flame, threaded it, and set the first pass while he sat stone still. Where'd you learn? He asked at the third stitch, and she said, here and there, and tied it off, and that was all the answer he got. He kept it dry like she told him, and the days settled into a rhythm with a warmth beneath the surface of it. He stopped asking after her past, and she stopped flinching when a rider came up sudden on her blind side. In the third week, a Chinook came down off the mountains and ate the early snow in an afternoon, and the world ran with meltwater and the smell of wet earth, and a few green hairs of growth pushed up in her doomed garden as if the land itself were play-acting at spring. He found her there with mud to her ankles. It's growing, he said, surprised. Some of it, late as it is. She pulled a thread of chickweed off a seedling. Things grow when you give them what they need. He was quiet a beat. That what you're doing here, Adelaide? Growing? She looked up. His face was different in the soft gray light, less like a wall. I'm trying, she said. Same as these. Same as anyone. That evening he came in soaked from checking the low fords, and she had hot coffee and towels and a fire going he didn't need, and he stood dripping in the door and smiled. A rusty, unused thing, like a hinge, that wasn't sure it still turned. You'll ruin my floors, she said. Your floors? I scrub them. That makes them mine. He laughed out loud, and the sound surprised them both. He took to going with her into the kitchen of an evening, sitting at the table with the ledger while she worked, and she should have told him he was underfoot and did not. One night he set down his pen. Tell me one true thing about yourself, he said. Doesn't have to be large, just real. We've built this whole arrangement on what neither of us will say, and I'm tired of it. I'd like to know you. Not your past, if you're not ready. Just the person in my kitchen now. She rolled the biscuit dough flat and bought herself a little time. I learned to cook from my mother, she said at last, in a boarding house back in Ontario. I helped her from the time I was tall enough to reach the range. She's gone now. That was true, and far from all of it, and he took it without grasping for more, and that was its own kindness. The hard week came with a cold snap that drove the warmth out of the Chinook's memory. One brutal afternoon she heard a crash from the front room, and found Ezra on the floor, eyes open and swimming, his skin gray and burning to the touch. Stood up too quick, he managed. Just dizzy. She got her hand to his forehead and felt the fever in it. How long, she said, and when he wouldn't answer she shoved back the sleeve over the stitched cut and found the kerchief he'd never once changed, filthy and stuck, the wound beneath it red and swollen with angry threads crawling out from the seam. You stubborn fool, she breathed, and half carried him to his room, the first time she'd seen inside it, sparse as a monk's cell with one photograph on the dresser of a young woman who must have been Cora. She boiled water and gathered what passed for physic in that house and went to work, and cleaning out a fevered wound is ugly labor. She opened it with a knife she'd held in the lamp till it cooled and let it drain, and packed it with a poultice she'd learned to make years before, and dosed him with laudanum from the cupboard until he slipped under. Then she pulled the hard chair to the bedside and sat. She told herself she was only keeping watch on the fever. The truer thing was that she could not stand the idea of him being sick and alone, because she knew to the marrow what that was. The night ran long. Twice she wrung out the cloth on his brow when it went warm. Once, deep in the small hours, the fever set him talking to people who weren't in the room. Cora, he said, his voice cracking like dry wood. Cora, he said, his voice cracking like dry wood. Cora, I'm sorry. She took his hand and held it, and then, because she had no one else awake in all that frozen country to say it to, because the dark had worn her own walls thin, she bent close to his ear and whispered the only prayer her mother had ever taught her. Lord, let the ones who are tired find rest, and the ones who are lost find a door. And she added her own to the end of it, low as breath, that this hard kind man not be taken, not him too, not while she had hands to keep him. She thought he was far under. She thought no living soul had heard her in 11 years of running. Toward dawn, the fever broke, and his eyes opened clear, and he found her there in the chair with his hand still in both of hers and exhaustion on her face, and the simple fact of her having stayed. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know." Why? She could have made it about wages or plain decency. He'd given her honesty in the dark, though, even if he didn't know he'd had it. "Because I couldn't bear you suffering it alone," she said. "I've had my fill of people suffering alone." Something moved behind his eyes, and before she could name it, he tightened his fingers on hers. "Stay," he said, "just till I'm asleep proper." So she stayed, and when Angus came looking and found her dozing in the chair beside the boss's bed, he backed out quiet and told the crew Mr. Marlowe was taking a sick day, and not one of them so much as raised a brow. It was the first day Ezra Marlowe had taken in 11 years, and some things the men knew well enough to guard. He mended slow and fought it the whole way. When she finally let him up, he stopped her at the door. "That night you stayed," he said, not looking at her, his eyes on the hallway ahead. "I was half out of my head, but I caught some of it. Not all. A prayer. You said a prayer over me." Her breath went still. "I just wanted you to know I heard it," he said quietly, "and that it was the first time in a long while I've gone to sleep believing somebody'd be there when I woke." Then he was gone down the hall, his boots loud on the boards, and she stood in the empty room with her heart doing something strange and unpracticed in her chest. A week on, with the first real snow holding off and the supplies wanting topping up before it came, he took her into Pine Coulee himself in the wagon, 2 hours of rutted road each way. He handled the lines easy, his shoulders looser than they ever were on the ranch. She watched the bald prairie roll by, the aspen bluffs gone gold and shedding. Halfway, with no warning, he said, "I had a wife. Cora. We met in Winnipeg when I was young and certain I knew everything. We came west and built this place out of grass and weather. She wanted children. We had a time of it, years, and then she was carrying, and we were so afraid and so glad we hardly slept." The wagon creaked. Something went wrong in the birthing. The doctor came out from town and did all he knew. She died. The boy never cried. I buried them both up on the rise under the lone poplar, and I've been walking through the days ever since. Not living. Just persisting. Until lately. He glanced at her. Until lately. In the dry goods store, while the keeper filled her long list, she drifted the aisles in a kind of daze at the plenty of it. After months of carrying her whole world on her back, she stopped at a card of ribbon, a green the color of new wheat, and reached for it before she could think better of such foolishness. "You should take it," Ezra said behind her, quiet as a cat. "It's frivolous. You're owed a frivolous thing. I can't. It's not out of your wage. Call it a bonus for putting up with a sick old fool for a month." Her throat tightened past arguing, and she said thank you, and meant it. They ate a terrible dinner at a shack by the edge of town under a leafless poplar, and agreed it was the worst food either of them had ever paid for, which somehow made the whole gray day shine. It was over the kitchen table, near a fortnight later, that the rest of it finally came. He'd asked again for one true thing, and this time she set down the rolling pin and gave it to him whole. There was a family in Ontario, she said, the Crandalls, old money and timber. I went into service with them at 17, companion to the widow, Mrs. Crandall the elder. She was sharp and kind, and I loved her like my own. For 9 years I read to her and dressed her and held her hand at the end, and when she died she left me a small bequest, a little money and a brooch that had been her own mother's, and a letter in her hand, laying it all out plain. Adelaide's jaw worked. Her son Lionel contested it. Said I'd worked on a dying woman's mind, said I'd taken what wasn't mine. He had the means to make a court believe most anything he liked, and he wanted me kept close and quiet, said if I'd stay on under his roof, unpaid, biddable, he'd let the matter rest, and if I wouldn't, he'd see me charged with theft and put away where talk couldn't reach. She rolled her sleeve and showed him, not a scar this time, but the flannel-wrapped weight she fetched from her satchel and unwound onto the table, an old silver brooch, and beside it a folded letter, soft as cloth from handling. So I ran, took what was lawfully mine, and got on a train, and didn't stop till the rails did. That was 8 months ago. Every town since, I've seen his men in the crowd. Every knock, I've thought it was the law come for me. She met his eyes. So when you ask who I am, I'm a woman. A rich man's called a thief, who's been running for the better part of a year, with the proof of it sewn in a mattress. That's your true thing. The clock ticked into a long silence. Then Ezra crossed the kitchen and folded her into his arms, and she went stiff with the shock of it. When had a touch last meant comfort and not a blow? I'm sorry, he said into her hair, rough. I'm sorry nobody stood for you. I'm sorry you had to stand alone. Something cracked in her that had been holding 8 months and longer, and she did not weep. She'd forgotten the way of it, but she shook with all of it, and he held her steady till it passed. The letter came under her cabin door 3 mornings later. No name, no postmark, just her own name and a hand she knew. The eastern fence at dusk. Come alone. We'll settle this between us. Lionel Crandall had found the end of her trail. She went through the day in a fog, and Ezra marked it at breakfast and didn't push. And when he'd ridden out, she stood in the kitchen and made herself think. She could run again. She had run 1,000 miles already, and the man had still walked up her road. There was no far enough, she could tell Ezra, but the words tangled. So at 5:30 she left the supper warming and walked the 20 cold minutes to the eastern fence, where the sun was going down, red over the foothills, and he was waiting by the rails with his good hat in his hands. Lionel Crandall was thinner than she remembered, and older, and the soft eastern polish on him looked wrong against the raw country. Adelaide, he said, smiling without any of it reaching his eyes, you've led me a chase. She stopped 10 feet off. Whatever you've come to say it from there. He came to talk sense, he said, to bring her home, where her keep was assured and her little misunderstanding could be forgotten if she'd only be reasonable. Reasonable, she repeated, and the word came out of her sharp as broken glass. You called me a thief in front of a magistrate, you'd have had me caged. And you want me grateful for the chance to wait on you the rest of my life for nothing but the privilege of your silence. His face went flat then, the courtesy peeling off it. You're a servant girl with a stolen brooch and a forged letter, and a word from me in the right ear puts you in a cell. I'd think on that if I were you. Then say the word, she said, and took a step toward him so that he, not she, gave ground. Go to the mounted police, tell them the whole of it, and I'll tell them mine, and we'll find out together whose word the law believes when the letter's read in your mother's own hand. I'm done running from you, Lionel. Go to the law or get off this man's land. Either way, you and I are finished. He lunged. She'd been waiting for it since she saw him, and she sidestepped and let him stumble past into the rail. And her rifle shot split the dusk like a dropped axe and froze them both. Ezra stood 30 feet off with the gun pointed at the sky. Angus McCrae at his shoulder and 3 of the crew fanned out behind, Davy among them, white-faced and dead serious. Ezra worked the lever, chambered another, and his voice came level and cold. You'll want to walk away from here. I'll count it for you. 1. Lionel drew himself up. This is between me and 2. You can't. 3. Adelaide walked past Lionel without a glance, her head high, and went straight to Ezra, not hurrying, just walking, while the count went on behind her. You'll regret this, Lionel called, while the count went on behind her. You'll regret this, Lionel called. Both of you. 6, Angus said, his hand on his pistol, and I'd be using the rest of the daylight to ride, friend. A 9, the man turned and went, fast, his horse throwing clods, and Ezra never fired the 10. He only watched the rise, until it was empty. Then lowered the gun, and Adelaide reached him and her knees gave at last, and he caught her, the rifle clattering down. I've got you, he said against her hair. I've got you. Angus cleared his throat. Me and the boys, I'll see him clear off the lease. Make sure he keeps going. Don't harm him, she said. Just gone. Yes, ma'am. They didn't leave it to chance. Angus McCrae had a cousin who wore the scarlet at Fort Calgary, and a brother-in-law who sat as a magistrate, and within the week the letter in Mrs. Augury. Crandall's hand was before men who knew how to read such things, and the truth of Lionel's counterclaim, a thing got up after the fact, witnessed by men in his own pay, came apart under a hard eye. It took into the new year, and a cold journey to give her account before a panel of grave men in a cold-paneled room, with Ezra beside her and Angus's brother-in-law, tearing Lionel's story to rags. But the day came when an old magistrate with white whiskers looked over his spectacles and ruled the bequest sound and the charge malicious, and warned Lionel Crandall that the territories took a dim view of men who'd misused the law to hound a woman across a continent. There was no grand repentance in him at the end, no softening. He simply gathered his papers and left the room a smaller man than he'd entered it. And outside in the snow he stopped once, on the step, and said only, "He's a better man than I ever troubled to be. See that he knows it," and was gone east, and she watched him go and felt nothing at all but the loosening of the fist that had been closed around her chest for a year. He courted her properly through that long winter and the green spring after. He drove her to town of a Saturday and bought her bad dinners and let her finger goods she didn't need. He brought her crocuses off the bald hills in April, left them on the table without a word. He read to her in the evenings while she sewed, and never once asked for a thing she wasn't ready to give. The hands took to calling her Miss Adelaide, then forgot the miss, and asked her opinion on the cooking and the schedule and the worth of a horse. And somewhere in it she stopped bracing for the blow that never came. Out behind the cabin, the garden she'd planted half in grief came up that second summer riotous and green, beans climbing the stakes she'd driven, and she understood that she had been planting for herself all along. He asked her under the lone poplar on the rise where Cora and the boy lay, because she said she'd have it nowhere else, that this wasn't about painting over the past, but about honoring it while she built something new beside it. She said yes before he'd finished the asking. They married in the early autumn under that same tree. The whole crew turned out scrubbed and miserable in their collars, Angus weeping into his hat and Davy grinning fit to split, and the men had pitched in for a new cook stove she'd once admired aloud and never thought of again, and she cried when she saw it, undone by the plain fact that rough men had listened and cared. There was a fiddle after, and dancing in the yard, clumsy and joyful, and she danced with every man on the place until her feet ached and she could not stop laughing. The first child came the next summer. In the terror of it nearly unmade her, Cora's name in her mouth in the dark, the old fear that this was the country where women went into a birthing and did not come out. But Angus's cousin had a wife who'd brought half the babies in the district into the air, and she stayed the week, and the labor was long and hard, and ended in a daughter's furious cry. They named her Cora, and Ezra wept onto the child's blanket, and Adelaide watched the man she loved go gentle as water with a baby in his great scarred hands, and felt something old and broken in her finally set and knit. A son followed 2 years on, and another girl after, and the house that had rung with 11 years of silence filled up with noise and mud and the slamming of doors. The ranch prospered, not because they chased it, but because they tended it, and the deeded land grew and the herd grew, and they added rooms onto the house, as they added children to it. The railway brought new neighbors and the district filled in, and Chinooks came each winter to give them back a day of false spring before the cold closed down again. Ezra lived longer than a man with his early griefs had any right to, because there was suddenly so much worth the trouble of staying for. He was an old gray man with his daughters grown when his heart began to fail him by inches, and he fought it 3 years for her sake and the children's. And when he went at last, it was in the spring with the window open and her hand in his. And his final word was the same one she'd said over him once in a fever long ago. Only this time it was thank you. The grief was a country she had to walk through, and she did not break in it, because she'd learned over 30 years what grief was. It was love with nowhere left to go, and she had places enough to put it. They buried him on the rise under the poplar, between Cora and the son who'd never breathed, and Angus McCrae, bent and white now, spoke over him with a steady voice and a streaming face, and said Ezra Marlowe had been the best man he'd known, fair and stubborn and loyal to the bone, and that finding happiness twice over after losing everything was no tragedy at all but a quiet sort of triumph. Afterward she sat alone in the new grass between the graves and told Cora to mind him, that he'd been hers first and she only borrowed, and to keep him close until her own time came. Her time was long in coming. She ran the house and the books and the garden, and she did not merely persist. She lived, because that was the whole of what their life together had been. The bare stubborn choice to keep living in the teeth of every reason not to. She taught her granddaughters to make biscuits from her mother's hand, and her grandsons to read of an evening the way Ezra had read to her. She saw the District of Alberta become a province with its own name, saw motor cars frighten the horses on the Calgary Road, saw 18 grandchildren born and held 3 of their children before the end. She lived to 80 and died on a spring morning in her sleep with a smile on her and her hand resting on the photograph she kept beside the bed, the 2 of them on their wedding day under the poplar, looking at one another as if the whole hard country had narrowed to that single patch of shade. They laid her on the rise with the others. 4 graves now in the long grass where the wind came down off the mountains, and the headstone read only her name and the years and the words she'd chosen herself. She stopped running. The ranch went on for generations, and great-grandchildren who never knew her face still heard the story of the woman who walked up the coulee in October with nothing but a satchel and a secret sewn in straw, and gambled the last of herself on the chance that a hard, lonely man might be kind. Her garden, tended by hands she'd never meet, still came up green each summer on the same broken ground. The lone poplar grew tall and split the wind, and anyone who climbed that rise on a clear day could see what 2 people had built out of grief and grass and the small, impossible courage it takes to say yes when every easy thing in the world is telling you to say no, to stay, to plant, to let another soul see the broken places and trust they'll be held there and not used against you. That was the whole of it, in the end, and it was enough. I keep coming back to the morning. Adelaide walked up that coulee in cracked boots, with everything she owned held against her stomach, and what strikes me now isn't how lucky she got. It's that none of her ending came free. Every good thing that found her, she had already paid for with some quiet choice nobody was watching her make. She could have lied to Ezra. It would have been easier. A woman running from a powerful man learns to shade the truth the way the rest of us learn to breathe. But she set that brooch and that letter on his kitchen table and told him the whole ugly shape of it. And that was the only reason he could stand between her and Lionel when the time came. You cannot ask a person to defend a story you've kept hidden from them. The honesty came first. The protection followed. That's the order of it, and it almost never runs the other way. I think about the night she sat by his fevered bed and whispered over him when she believed no one could hear. There was no reward waiting in that. She did it because she'd had her fill of people suffering alone, and a person who will sit up all night for a near stranger with nothing promised in return is showing you the truest part of themselves. Ezra heard it. Of course he did. We always end up trusting the ones who are decent when they think the lights are off. But goodness on its own would not have saved her. What saved her was that she also kept her head. She didn't bolt again when Lionel's note came under her door, though every nerve in her body must have screamed run. She thought it through. She saw that there's no far enough. That the only way past a man like that is straight through him in front of witnesses in the law. That was not softness, and it was not luck. That was clear, hard judgment, under pressure, and it is a thing you can build in yourself if you practice refusing to panic. And underneath all of it was the plain refusal to lie down. 8 months of trains and strange towns and knocks, she was sure were the constable. And she still stood at that gate one more time and asked for work. Angus saw it in her before Ezra did, that she'd walked country that kills people and was still on her feet. The grit to take one more step when the last one nearly finished you is the least glamorous virtue there is, and it carries more people home than talent ever has. So when I tell Adelaide's story, I'm not really telling you about a cowboy and a stranger. I'm telling you that a decent heart, a steady mind, and a back that won't break tend to arrive together, and that the life you build is mostly just the sum of the small brave things you did when no one was keeping score.